Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Turn the Page. I'm Jenn, your host for today, and I'm here with an extremely talented illustrator and maker of comics who is here with their debut sort of long form work. And I'm so excited to talk about it. So let's hop right in. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Yeah, so my name is Nicole Goux. I've been making comics for, I don't know, probably 8-10 years, something like that. And I do all kinds of things. I've done work for DC, for Simon & Schuster, and I usually often work in the adult spaces, and often I work with writers. So this book, Peeves, is kind of the longest thing that I've written and drawn on my own. And it is a little tricky to describe because there's there's some possible twisty things in it. But essentially it is about a bartender who just got out of college and is kind of trying to make her way as a musician, and she's feeling really lost. And on her way home from work one night, picks up a stray dog and things ensue.
That's a great setup because it's very intriguing and it doesn't give too much away about where it goes, because you're right, there are some really fantastic twists and turns. Yeah, this book like blew me away. And as I said before we started to record, I read it twice over the weekend because I usually like to read things twice for interviews, like once for enjoyment and like the holistic view and once for questions. But like I would have done that even if I didn't have to. And
the best compliment.
You're very welcome. And yeah, I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about what it was like doing something longer than you normally work, I guess the length you normally work in, and if that presented any new challenges that sort of like prompted you to develop any new strategies maybe.
Yeah, I'm not sure necessarily about new strategies, but maybe in talking about it I'll get there. But it definitely was a different process for me because usually most of the comics that I've written have been, tops 12 pages. And this book was actually supposed to be 20 pages. But I realized that in the type of storytelling that I wanted to explore, which is very character-based, and I needed the time to give these characters a bit of environment and atmosphere to show you who they were. And it kind of just kept getting longer and longer. And I think my script ended up being something like 80 pages or some. But in the process of drawing it, even then I went back and found places where, I really need more of this, or I really need a scene with this person to kind of give you an idea of their place in the story. And I don't normally work that way. I like to have a roadmap, and I like to know where I'm going and who's saying what, because I'm very focused on acting. So it was new for me to go back and change things and add things, and make my story longer and longer, because comics take a really long time, and the idea of adding stuff to your process and making it take longer, it can be a little daunting, and you have to really be committed to, I want this story to be the best that it can be, to go, hey, I really think I should add another scene here, or it really needs this. And that can be, luckily for this project, I had no deadline. This was completely personal, and I could just play with it as much as I wanted for as long as I wanted.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I'm glad that you had the time to sort of explore, the new challenges associated with something long. And that's really cool to learn that it did sort of lengthen, as it was written, because it has a really nice slow burn quality, and that always like draws me right in. I love a good slow burn. And I'm wondering, like, in crafting a slow burn, you're playing with a really interesting tension between like, dripping little details that are going to keep the reader engaged and involved, but also not revealing too much so that there is like this continuing element of mystery that also kind of like, refuses to give the reader the closure that they want. So how do you balance these sort of like opposing forces, like when you're drafting the story?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely was one of the challenges of writing this book because I wanted the end to be what it is, which hopefully is unexpected. And so the initial passes of the script didn't have as much kind of like seeded hints about what's happening. And I think even now it is fairly limited. You're not going, oh, I know where this is going, hopefully. But that was one of the things that I went back and added is, I think we really need to have more of the like an ominous tone that something is not right here. And these little hints that maybe things are not what we think they are. And kind of finding the places to add that into my story or to hint about it, I think was actually really fun, but also kind of challenging because it's that balance, right? Of how much do I do, how much do I not do? And I'm not sure exactly if I struck the perfect balance, but I have heard that surprise is there.
Yeah, I think so. It's really well done. And something that as you were talking that occurred to me is that like it's really nice actually, I think, or fitting to tell that kind of story about like this phase of life, that sort of like early 20s, mid-20s, like agony of like being in this transition like phase in your life when you're not really sure what you're gonna do. Um, yeah, it really captures that like angst and that listlessness that sort of like a slow burn actually really encapsulates well because I think a lot of your life can feel like a slow burn at that like phase.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, I was an art kid, but I was also a school kid. Like I was really good at classes and academia, and I was not maybe your perfect student all the time, but I was definitely a gold star kid who had a path, knew what I wanted, had all the structure of school, was good at my classes, got A's. And so when you take that away, kind of really suddenly after college, and particularly with people who are in the arts, there is no path anymore. And especially for this generation or my generation, things have gotten harder and harder to find a path or to be able to support yourself with temporary things, working at a bar, working at a coffee shop, these kinds of things. It's not, you can't even really live anymore doing that stuff while you explore which direction you should be going. And I think, I don't know that I would necessarily say it's exactly universal because I don't know if you're a lawyer, maybe you know exactly what you're doing. But I think a lot of people experience that kind of floundering once you've left the kind of swaddling of school and academia and a determined path and adults telling you this is what you should do next.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's like a determined path in school, this like structure that sort of like provides you validation regularly,
Mm-hmm. Yes.
and and there's systems in which like meaning is made for you, and like you are then dumped into the real world where all of a sudden like all that meaning is kind of removed and you have to like start to make your own meanings, and that's really really hard.
It's incredibly hard. And it's something that I still struggle with. And one of the reasons, so when I went into school, I went to be a drawing and painting major. And then I switched to illustration. And then when I got out of school, I switched to comics because I like having a path. And when you have 200 pages, or in this case, 94 pages of a book to draw, you know what you're doing every day. And so there's this kind of like in between level of structure that I think, some people are great and they can, go be an artist and make new music every day or create whole cloth an idea for a gallery show or a new piece every week. And some of us need a little bit more direction that they need an article to work from. They need a script to be working on consistently or just have a little bit of guidance, even if it's self-determined guidance, I wrote this book myself. Nobody wrote it for me. Nobody made me do it. But having, at least a temporary path or a direction to be going, I think can be really helpful for people. And when you don't have that, it can often lead to this, well, I want to make the thing, but I don't know what I want to make and I don't know how to do it. I just like doing it, and it can be really, especially when you're in your early 20s, it can be a really difficult time for people.
Absolutely. Yeah. And something else that kind of I was thinking about too is the way that like the school kind of sells you this idea that like your success is going to hinge entirely like on your own efforts and your own willpower. And the world that Bobby, our protagonist, is operating in this story is like not that kind of world. Like for her, there are like some odd things going on that kind of keep her from making her music. But like for the rest of us, there are tons of forces in society that like keep us from, doing the things that we want to do or making the art we want to make, like capitalism and having a job that like takes the life out of you, and all those things that kind of stand between you and like the access to that willpower, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think this story is kind of about two things. It's about that time and that struggle of losing the structure, and then it's also about how these things or opportunities or kind of obstacles can come into your life and either help you enhance your experience and push you along, or they can kind of hold you back or lead into your kind of doubts and your self-sabotage and draw you down the wrong path, even if they feel like the right path at the time.
Yeah, there's like a really a fine line that you kind of like tread with Bobby, where she is, she's allowed to be like sympathetic because she's like in this burnout, she's like struggling with what she wants to do in her life. She's living with like her kind of ex, which like, is like, I think a lot of us have been there, like in that phase of life, and it's really, really not fun. And that's kind of sense that like your friends are outgrowing you a little bit and kind of leaving you behind. And like all that's going on for her that makes you really empathize with her, but also like she can be like a kind of difficult person who, as you say, like does self-sabotage and like doesn't always like relate to people with like the most kindness or so yeah, you talk about so like in characterization and sort of walking that line.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you found her sympathetic because I do wonder a little bit because she is difficult and she doesn't fight for herself in the ways that we often want to see protagonists do. We want the big, oh, I'm going to overcome this. I'm going to push through. I'm going to get this success. Most of the stories we read are about overcoming something. And that's not always the reality of life. And I think that you can be a deeply flawed person and still be sympathetic. I think Bobby as a character is difficult, and I relate to her because of the struggling artist thing, and because some of the things that come into her life, they feel good, but they drag her down, right? And or allow her to kind of, again, lean into some of her more negative traits. And I think, I don't know exactly how to answer the question because I just think of, building characters who are flawed. And in the other books that I've worked on, usually when I work with other people, there is a writer and then I'm the artist, but there's a lot of collaboration up front about character and story and what we want things to be. And we read the scripts before anything gets drawn. And we've had some scripts where there is a character who is deeply flawed, but they don't really have any seed of I can relate to this, or the person is just, can I cuss on this? I don't know.
Yeah,
just
sure.
not a nice person. Just kind of shitty. And I think in order for the reader to be in a story and to kind of empathize or relate to it, there has to be some seed of I can see myself in this, or I can understand why that person's doing this. Because, and maybe I'm alone in this, but we went through a big spate of TV shows where every character was just horrible all the time. And I tried to watch some of them, and I know that, if I really sat down and watched Mad Men, I'd probably like it. But from the first few episodes, I was just like, why would I want to watch this? Because there's not because I need a perfect character, but because there's nothing in this that I can relate to. And again, I know it's a great show. If I really sat down and watched it, I'm sure it's good. But like, I really like to make sure that there's something in there that your reader can like tease out and understand. Like for example, the roommate Clara. Some of what I tried to add into her, because she can come off as, I think, very not understanding as well. But her reason comes from frustration of, she's maybe a little bit further along and trying her best to grow up and trying her best to get her life together. And then there's this person who is not at that same place. And there's this frustration, there's this tension of, I'm finally ready to like level up my life or move on a little bit or become a little bit more adult. And there's this person who has been your best friend for a long time who's just not at that same place. And so there's this kind of friction and vibration there. And I think Clara can probably come off as being a dick, but it comes from a place of, look, I'm really trying to do this thing and you're just not, you're holding me back.
Yeah, she's sort of in a lose-lose situation a little bit, like, because she either, will seem like she's abandoning her friend or runs the risk of like not being able to reach her own goals, because she's so concerned with it.
Yeah. And there are many opportunities, or I guess many circumstances in life where there is no win, and you just make the decisions that feel right for you at the time. And sometimes those decisions are right and sometimes they're not.
Yeah. It's like, gosh, it's really relatable, I think, for all the characters. And I like stories that sort of like don't really have like a traditional antagonist, rather, but like where the antagonist is just like the inevitability of interpersonal conflict,
Capitalism.
Yes. Oh no. And we haven't talked very much about Barkley yet, and that's sort of been intentional because I don't want to reveal too much about him. But if you could talk a little bit about like the subtle supernatural elements at work here, and you do briefly mention that Barkley's name is a Star Trek Next Generation reference, which I am a huge fan of. So you could also talk about your own relationship to Star Trek. I'd love that too.
Oh, we'll be on here for the next 2 hours if you ask me about Star Trek. His name is Barkley mostly because I thought it was funny. But my feelings about Lieutenant Barkley have changed. I initially hated him because he's horrible. But, over the years, there is kind of a fondness for Lieutenant Barkley. I was really trying to come up with clever names for reference for anyone who's not read it. The dog that she adopts, she names Lieutenant Barkley. And I had all these, very kitschy, very literal names that I was playing around with that were supposed to sort of hint at the mystery and the supernatural of the story. And I kind of was just like, what would some, 20-something name their dog, and it's always like a food name, right, or something. But the pun of Barkley was just very satisfying. The combo of getting to put a Star Trek reference and having a pun at the same time was very satisfying to me.
It's super cool to me, like how, without needing to define like the supernatural elements, they are like very expressionistic of Bobby's internal state. So maybe you talk about like, externalizing like personal struggles as like horror or supernatural horror.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the supernatural that happens in this in this book.
Hopefully someday.
One day, we'll see. Is I think it is external because there are literal things happening, but it is also very internal because a lot of it is related through dreams. So it is her internal state, and it is what's happening, and it's also happening inside her head because we're we are understanding it through dream or what is perceived as dream. And I think being able to, it's that idea of trying to figure out what your dreams are about, right? Where it's this thing that is you, but feels external, but is this like kind of, what am I trying to say here? Exploring what is actually happening, or the kind of metaphor of what's happening through what is literally happening, which is happening in a dream. That's so confusing. I don't know.
I totally get what you mean, though. Yeah, because like dreams are sort of like our insides trying to tell us what's going on.
Exactly. Yeah. And is it even a dream? You have to read the book and decide for yourself. But yeah, I think the dreams are also a way of warning her about what is happening and what could happen to her. And I think that we have a lot of internal systems that set off alarms in us that you can either listen to or you can ignore. And I know that at points in my life, I have definitely ignored big glaring warning signs because I wanted something that went against them, right? So you have this goal, or you think you want this thing, and the warning signs are saying, hey, maybe that's not good or safe. Don't do that. And you're like, but I really want it. And that was just a dream, or that was just a one-time thing, And so, we have kind of these mechanisms, gut feelings, or literal, sometimes literal physical symptoms of, you can feel that kind of warning or trauma in your body sometimes. That, if we're healthy and well developed and know what we're doing and not feeling lost, maybe we listen to them and go, hey, or maybe if we're just a little bit older, we listen to them and go, maybe that's not the best idea. But when you are struggling to figure out who you are, you kind of grasp onto anything that gives you a source of direction. And I think for Bobby, Barkley is that source of direction. And even though she may know deep down that something is wrong, she is so lacking in the structure or knowing what she wants that she goes towards that anyway.
Yeah, the book does such a really lovely job of portraying like this really tumultuous life period, and also looking at how it like interacts with like very real things in the world that we actually live in, and some things that are a little bit hopefully less real in our world. And yeah, I enjoy this book so much, and thank you for bringing it to me and for having this conversation.
Well, thank you so much for reading it. I'm so glad you enjoyed it, and I hope anybody listening to this will also enjoy it.
Yes, listeners, now it's on you. I implore you to go check out Pet Peeves. It is an absolutely lovely and eerie book that will really stay with you for a long time. Thank you so much for joining us. It is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.